I was born in 1947 in the frozen belly of Alaska, in a tiny village where whispers traveled faster than the wind and pain was something everyone carried, even if they spoke of it only in half voices. My mother gave birth to me alone during a snowstorm, in a wooden house creaking under the weight of winter. They say I didn't cry when I was born. I just looked around with wide, unblinking eyes, as if I already understood what kind of life was waiting for me. My name is Edith Walker, and for a long time, that was the only thing I had that truly belonged to me. Even my name felt borrowed, passed down from a grandmother nobody ever spoke about. I grew up in a house where the most familiar sound was the click of a lock turning and the muffled yelling behind paper-thin walls. My father, Edward, was a dry, silent man with heavy hands and a heart carved out of ice. He smelled like earth and cheap liquor. He worked from dawn till dark like all the men in town, and at night he'd shake off the day with his fists. My mother, Margaret, didn't say much, but her silence always weighed more than any word. They used to say she once loved a kind man from Juneau, a doctor with gentle eyes. But her father disapproved and forced her to marry Edward, a loyal, severe man who only knew control. She never forgave that, and all the bitterness she carried landed on me. In my face, she didn't just see a daughter. She saw a reminder of the life she lost, the way she looked at me. It was like I was her personal failure. My brother Daniel was the only light I had. He was 7 years older than me and dreamed of becoming an engineer. He used to hide books under the mattress and read them late at night by candlelight, covered with a glass jar to keep the flame steady. He was the one who taught me to read. I was 8 when I first ran my fingers across the yellowed pages of Tolstoy and realized that words could warm you more than any stove. We hid our books under the floorboards in a spot only we knew. Each story was a window into a different world, but our village didn't forgive girls who looked alive. At school, we were taught not to think but to obey. A good girl is a quiet girl, the teachers repeated, so I learned to keep my mouth shut, but not my heart. Time dragged on like a sled through deep snow. Every winter felt longer and heavier, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow us whole. I remember my 12th birthday clearly. No cake, no gifts, no kind words. My father came home late, his eyes bloodshot, threw his coat on the floor, and without saying a word began to beat my mother with a belt. I wanted to run to her, but Daniel held me back. "Not now, Edith," he whispered, and his hands were shaking. When it was finally quiet again, my mother wiped the blood from her face and looked at me with eyes cold as ice. "If you don't learn to obey, you'll end up like me." Those words burned into me like a brand. When I turned 15, I met Grandma Cora, a widow who lived in a blue cottage by the lake. Her hands were wrinkled, but her heart was full of forgotten songs. She taught me to sew. I used to sneak away under the excuse of fetching water, and she'd show me patterns, telling me how women used to stitch their stories into the hems of their dresses. With each thread, I felt like I was weaving not just fabric, but a path toward freedom. Everything changed when I turned 17. My mother called me into her room, her face stiff like a judge, and told me I would marry Charles Mitchell, a 35-year-old man with ties to the party. There was no joy in her eyes, only relief, like she was finally free of a burden. "He's a respected man. He'll take care of you," she said, as if care meant a locked cage. I had seen him before. Cold eyes, heavy hands. I remembered what happened to Olivia, my distant cousin. She vanished one day and no one ever spoke of her again. I felt something twist inside me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake counting the steps it would take to reach the forest. I knew if I stayed, they'd break me. If I ran, I might die. But there was no real choice. In the dead of night, someone tapped softly at my window. It was Aunt Laura, my mother's younger sister, the one who had escaped to the city years ago. "If you're going, go now," she whispered. I grabbed a small bag, a change of clothes, 2 of my favorite books, and a needle Grandma Cora had called my talisman. Snow fell slowly as I left the only home I'd ever known. I didn't look back. The road to Anchorage was long, cold, and full of fear. But for the first time in my life, I was walking on my own feet. and for the first time, the silence around me didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a promise. My dear, if you've listened this far, it means you're really hearing me, with your heart. And if this grandmother's story has touched even a small part of your soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right? That way, you'll stay close to me for every chapter still to come. I tell these stories with deep love and the gentleness of my whole soul. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being here, for hearing me. You have no idea how much that means to me. We traveled in a freight car packed with people, silence, and breath. Aunt Laura didn't say much on the journey. She just held my hand tightly, like she was afraid I'd disappear like a puff of steam in the frost. The train clattered and moaned, and it felt like it wasn't carrying people, but whole destinies. Among us were women with empty eyes, soldiers with hardened stares, and children hiding their faces in their mothers' chests. I sat clutching my bag tightly against me, everything I owned inside. Books, clothes, a needle, and a heart pounding with both fear and hope. When we arrived in Anchorage, the morning was gray and damp. My aunt lived on the outskirts, in an old shared apartment where 4 people occupied a single room. She shared her space with an elderly woman named Ruth and 2 college girls, and I became the 5th. There was barely enough room to sleep, but no one complained. I was like a shadow, quiet, invisible, grateful just to have a roof over my head and a piece of bread. During those first days, I hardly left the room. I felt like the city looked at me as an outsider. Back in my village, people knew my name, my face, my story. Here, I was no one. And that was a relief. I could breathe. I could walk the streets, and no one told me who to be. But freedom without direction is hollow. I had no idea what to do, who to become, or where to begin. My aunt got me a job as an apprentice at a garment factory. The place smelled like soap, sweat, and fabric. The machines clattered, needles snapped, and the days passed in monotonous labor. At first, I was only allowed to fetch materials, clean, mop the floors. But I watched. I absorbed every motion, every fold of cloth, every careful stitch. In the evenings, I took scraps and sewed little dresses for dolls, then started making my own scarves and embellishing them with embroidery. One day, a senior seamstress, Mrs. Tamara, noticed a seam I'd done and raised her brows in surprise. "Where'd you learn that, girl?" she asked. I just shrugged. I never told anyone about Grandma Cora. That was my secret. At the same time, I signed up for night classes. Learning was hard. The city dialect was different from our rural speech. I'd fallen out of the habit of classrooms, didn't know the terminology. But there was a student at the library named Alex who helped me. He was studying to be a teacher. Soft-spoken, polite, with warm eyes. We became friends. Sometimes he brought me books, explained how to write essays, laughed gently at my mistakes, but never mocked me. His voice was the first male voice near me that didn't carry threat. 2 years passed. I was 19. I was no longer the girl who once hid books under the floor. I had a work ID, a passport, a few friends, and a notebook where I sketched my own designs. At night, I sewed obsessively. Dress after dress, blouse after shawl. I dreamed of opening a boutique someday. It was probably silly. I was just a village girl, but when I held a finished piece in my hands, nothing else mattered. Everything changed that autumn when layoffs hit the factory. Work dried up. Paychecks shrank. Mrs. Tamara resigned and moved in with her daughter in Seattle. Everyone feared the factory would shut down. I knew if I wanted to survive, I had to find another way. One evening, walking back from the library, I saw a sign in the window of a small shop. Seeking assistant seamstress. Attention to detail and hand embroidery a plus. I walked in without thinking. Inside, it smelled like lavender and steam. Behind the counter stood a woman in a crisp dress with gray eyes and the presence of a conductor. Her name was Mrs. Lydia. She listened quietly as I spoke, examined my scarves silently, then said, "Come tomorrow. Show me what you can do." That was the beginning of a new chapter. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff again, but not out of fear, out of anticipation. The city no longer felt like an enemy. It was a vast, noisy machine. Complicated but fair. If you worked hard, it noticed you. I decided I'd become a true artisan. And one day, my name would be on the door. Not as an employee, but as an owner. It was reckless, bold. But I'd already walked out of the dark once. I wasn't going back. From the moment I stepped into Mrs. Lydia's boutique, a new life began. Fragile as silk, but strong like a thread in embroidery. The space was modest, but every item had its place. Bolts of fabric lined up neatly by the wall. Scissors gleamed like freshly sharpened blades, buttons sorted by size and color like gemstones. I understood immediately. This wasn't just work. It was a ritual, and every motion had to be precise, deliberate, respectful. Not of the objects, but of the craft. On my first day, she asked me to remove the old embroidery from a dress without damaging the fabric. My hands trembled, and I worked slowly. Mrs. Lydia watched in silence. When I finished, she nodded. No praise, just a nod. But in her gaze, I saw respect, and that meant more than words. For the next week, I worked without days off. I arrived early at the factory before it fully shut down, then spent the evenings at the boutique. I sewed, cleaned, studied, practiced. Mrs. Lydia wasn't warm in the usual sense. She didn't smile for no reason, didn't offer easy compliments, didn't pat you on the head, but her advice was always exact. She taught me not just to sew, but to see how fabric falls on a body, how color mirrors mood, how a single button can transform an entire dress. She'd say, "A true artisan isn't someone who makes something pretty. It's someone who works with soul." I absorbed everything. At night, walking home, I'd replay every stitch, every phrase. My notebooks became swatches of cloth, where I sketched combinations, patterns, designs. Sometimes Alex would drop by with a roll or hot tea. He was teaching by then and seemed to take more pride in my small triumphs than in his own. More and more, our conversations shifted from the past to the future. And one winter evening, he said, "Edith, you're more than a seamstress. You're an artist. Do you know that?" I laughed, not from sarcasm, but from joy. Someone had finally seen what I'd always kept hidden. That spring, the boutique received a large order. Wedding gowns for the daughters of city officials. I helped with fittings, worked on the trim. One of the girls, Tanya, asked for changes to the design, against instructions. I suggested a different lace and added a subtle motif I'd once learned from Grandma Cora. When she tried it on, the entire room went silent. Even Mrs. Lydia came over, touched the edge of the sleeve, and said, "This one's yours, isn't it?" I nodded, and for the first time, she smiled. "Leave it just like that. It's better this way." After that, she began to trust me more. I started working on smaller elements. Collars, cuffs, hems. Sometimes I'd be given full dresses to sew from someone else's designs. But inside me, a dream was growing. I wanted to create something of my own. Something that wasn't just clothing, but a story. With every stitch, I was threading my life, my path, my voice. One day at the library, I came across a book about traditional folk embroidery patterns. The symbols were ancient as the land itself. Speaking of protection, strength, and feminine energy, I realized then that this was my language. I began to sew scarves that carried hidden meanings. A cross for home protection, a spiral for growth, a sun for the journey inward. The women I gave them to didn't always understand the symbols, but they felt something personal in those pieces. 6 months later, Mrs. Lydia offered me my own table. That was her way of acknowledging me. I became part of the atelier. Not just an assistant, but a craftswoman. I started to attract my own clients. One of them, a stage actress named Evelyn Moore, commissioned a dress from one of my sketches for her premiere. I trembled as I watched her try it on for the first time, but once on stage, she looked like a queen. After the show, she hugged me and said, "Girl, you don't belong in a back room. You belong in New York. You don't just sew, you create." Those words settled in me like a seed. New York. This city I knew only from books, distant, almost mythical. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a destination, I told Alex. He looked at me seriously, then said, "If you go, I'll go with you." In that moment, I realized he wasn't just a man. He was a partner. Someone I could walk beside to the edge of the world. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared out the window at the late city lights and thought, the journey that began as an escape is now leading me to a summit. I didn't know yet what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. There was no going back. I was ready. When I told Mrs. Lydia I was planning to move to New York, she stayed silent for a long time. Her expression held no judgment, only concern. She slowly removed her glasses, set them down, and said, "New York is beautiful, but it doesn't forgive the weak. Be ready not just to succeed, but to lose." I nodded. I knew exactly what she meant. Every step upward demands sacrifice. I had already lost my home, my mother, my childhood, my peace. But now I was willing to risk everything for one thing: the freedom to create. New York was a dream, but not an abstract one. It was real, like fabric under my fingers, like a needle in my hand. It was a place where seamstresses' names were spoken like artists: Navarro, King, Ashcroft. I wanted my name to be spoken that way too. One day, the move was hard. Alex and I packed everything we owned: one suitcase of clothes, a box of my tools, and a few small savings. He had been offered a position teaching at a boarding school for railway workers' children. I had no connections, no clients, just the certainty that I would find my place and a heart full of resolve. The road to New York felt long, almost magical. The train clattered down the tracks, trees and rivers and little stations flashing past the windows, where women sold tea in old thermoses and bundles of broomsticks. We sat together. He read, I sketched designs. We spoke little, but we understood each other without words. The first time I saw New York, it overwhelmed me. Tall buildings with carved facades, wide riverfronts, the glow of street lamps reflected in the Hudson. The city felt alive, like a person with a mood, a temper, and secrets. I breathed in its cold air and knew I was finally where I belonged. Here, you could become someone, or disappear if you couldn't endure. The first few weeks were rough. We rented a tiny room in a tenement off Delancey Street. The window opened into a shadowed courtyard, always dim and damp. I sent out dozens of letters to ateliers, fashion schools, design houses. Almost all went unanswered. The ones who replied looked at me with doubt. "You're from Alaska?" "No degree," some said. A few openly laughed at my scarves with symbols, calling them rustic. But I didn't give up. I sewed at night from scraps, walked the museums to sketch costumes, found inspiration in faces on the street. One afternoon in the park, I saw an elderly woman wearing a stunning shawl, deep blue with golden embroidery. I gently asked who made it. She looked surprised, then smiled. "That's the work of Ida Stein. She has a little shop on Canal Street, but you won't get in easily. She doesn't like outsiders." I went anyway. The address was strange. A door tucked between a bookstore and a pharmacy. Narrow stairs, creaking steps. Inside, a workshop and store combined. Antique mannequins, drafting tables, old mirrors, and a woman seated by the window, her silver hair pulled tightly back. "What do you want?" she asked without turning around. I placed my work in front of her. A scarf embroidered with a star and oak leaves. She sat in silence, then picked it up, studied it, and said, "You're not afraid of the line? That's rare." I just nodded. She stood, approached me, and looked me in the eyes. "I'll take you, but you'll start on the floor. Like everyone else." I agreed. I would have washed the floors just to learn from her. That's how I came into Ida Stein's atelier. The women who worked there were like temple priestesses. They didn't just sew. They knew fabric structure, color psychology, and pattern symbolism. Their dresses were bought by actresses, dancers, widows of wealth, and ministers' wives. I became a student again, but this time with fire in my chest. I sewed samples, observed, learned. I spoke little, but every word Ida said was a lecture. "Thread," she told me, "is not just a tool. It's a link between the maker and the wearer. 3 months in, she let me hem a theater gown. 5 months later, I designed a dress for a young soprano. It became a sensation. Ida simply said, "You're ready. Now do your own." That night, I cried. Not from pain, but from the feeling that I was truly beginning. Not just the path of a craftswoman, but of a woman who had torn her fate from the hands of silence. One early morning, as the city still slept beneath a blanket of fog, I stood at the atelier window, watching the street below. Cars rushed by. People passed without noticing each other. But I saw them all, and in each face, I searched for a story. I realized then that I wanted more. Not fame or money. I wanted a space where my thoughts, hands, and heart could live in every seam. In every silhouette, I longed for freedom, for responsibility, for my name, not scribbled in signatures, but carved on a sign above a door. A gate, I made my decision. When I told Ida, she listened with her eyes closed. When I finished, she opened them slowly, looked straight into my soul, and said, "If you're truly ready, go. But remember, it's easier to be a student than a master. Being a true artisan isn't just about sewing. It's about standing your ground." I bowed to her the way people bow to mentors in old legends, and I left. Alex and I found a small space on Roosevelt Island. Once a bakery, now abandoned, with peeling walls and crooked shelves. But it had high ceilings, a large window, and a door I could walk through each morning knowing, this is mine. We cleaned it together, painted, scrubbed, built new shelves, hung mirrors. Alex brought a wooden sign he carved himself. On it, the words, "Edith Walker, artisan of fabric and form." I stared at that sign for a long time. My name. Not hidden, not ashamed. Real. The first weeks were quiet, almost no clients. Some curious passers-by wandered in. I sat by the window, sewing, sketching, inventing. In the evenings, I taught embroidery to the neighborhood girls, just because at first they came out of politeness, then curiosity, and soon, with eyes full of light. It was the neighborhood girls who brought me my first real client. Her name was Elvira Dawson, a school teacher and a widow. She needed a dress for her upcoming birthday. Not something trendy, but something beautiful. "I want to feel like a woman again, not just a memory," she said. I made her a dress from deep blue silk with delicate embroidery along the hem. The pattern was inspired by ancient motifs symbolizing renewal. When she tried it on, I saw her shoulders straighten. She looked into the mirror and her eyes filled with tears. "I see myself again," she whispered. That's how it began. One woman, then another, some older, some younger. Lost, searching. I wasn't just sewing clothes. I was helping women reclaim themselves. Through fabric, through form, through quiet conversation. I became more than a craftswoman. I became a witness to their transformation. Alex supported me through it all. He taught at the school and helped with bookkeeping on weekends. He never interfered with the creative side, but he was always there. When we were short on rent, he sold his guitar. I cried, but he smiled. "As long as you have light," he said. A year later, we expanded. I hired 2 assistants, Lisa and Grace, young women I had trained myself. We worked like one body. Our pieces began to catch the attention of actresses, businessmen's wives. A local newspaper ran a story about us. I hadn't sought fame, but it found its way in. People said, "Edith Walker doesn't just make clothes. She gives them meaning." I decided to start offering free evening classes for women from low-income families. I taught them to sew, cut patterns, embroider. Some came timid, beaten down, but over time their hands grew steadier. One student, Maria, once said, "You're not just teaching us to sew. You're teaching us how to breathe." And it was true. I knew what it was like to have no one believe in you. To be told your place was to stay silent and endure. I knew, and I wanted to be a voice for those still trapped in silence. The true test came with my mother's visit. She showed up unannounced, older now, hunched but still sharp-tongued. She looked around at the studio, at the women, at the work. She stayed quiet for a long time, then finally said, "So, you really made it. No husband, no village, no permission." I braced for judgment, but instead heard, "Maybe I was wrong." Those words were like a letter arriving decades late. I didn't embrace her, but something inside me let go. I no longer waited for approval. I had created it for myself. Outside the studio, my name hung on a wooden sign. People passed by, glanced in, stepped through the door, some by accident, but they left changed. I realized then that my name wasn't just a string of letters. It was a promise. A promise to every woman who's afraid, every woman who's tired, every woman who wants to stand tall again. My name was on the gate, and in the hearts of those I'd helped remember who they were, the letter came in mid-November. The envelope was gray, the handwriting unfamiliar and jagged. I opened it standing by my work table, where I had just laid out a new piece of fabric. The paper trembled in my hands. Just 2 sentences. Margaret Walker has passed away. Funeral on Saturday. The house is now yours. Signed, Town Council of Maple Hollow. I sat down, unable to feel my legs. The house is now mine. The words felt strange. The house I had run from. The house filled with pain, where I learned to stay silent. A house whose walls remembered screams, whispers, fear. And now it was mine. Alex came over quietly, sat next to me, wrapped an arm around me. We didn't speak. He understood everything without a word. I didn't know whether to go. What would be there for me? No one had waited for years. My mother was gone. My father had died long before, and Daniel had vanished in the early 90s, when everything collapsed and chaos took over. But my soul wouldn't let it go. It wasn't duty or formality. It was a need, as if a part of me was still hidden under those floorboards where Daniel and I used to stash our books. I went alone. Alex insisted I take a warm scarf, but didn't press further. He understood this was a path I had to walk alone. The road felt familiar and foreign at once. The same forests, the same frozen river. But the village welcomed me differently this time. No judgmental stares, no whispered gossip. Most of the people who remembered me as a child were gone. Only new faces remained. The children of those who once pointed fingers at my mother. The world had turned. I walked through the snow with steady steps, no longer as a girl, but as a grown woman. The house stood like an old man, stooped, gray, but still alive. The roof sagged. The windows were fogged with grime. Inside, it smelled of dampness and the past. In the kitchen, everything was as it had been. The kettle, the bowls, even the old tablecloth I remembered from childhood. In the bedroom, the bed my mother slept in still stood, and the wardrobe I used to fear opening. I opened it. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, a scarf I had embroidered as a child, and a letter. "Edith, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I never knew how to speak to you. I lacked the courage. I was angry. Not at you, but at myself. You were strong, I was broken, I feared your freedom. I'm sorry if you can forgive me." I read the letter once, twice, 3 times. First like a stone, then through tears, then in silence. I didn't know if I forgave her, but I knew one thing. I no longer held anger. That was an ending and a beginning. I stayed in the village for 3 days, slept in the old room, listened to the quiet, spoke with women at the cemetery. One of them, Mrs. Tessa, said, "We all remember you. You left, and after that, headscarves became fashionable. They say you're some great artisan now." I smiled. Not great, just someone who survived. She said, "Why don't you open something here?" The girls, we're losing them. All they see is the city, or the bottle, or the courthouse. They need your hands, your mind. I didn't respond right away, but the thought stayed with me. Opening something here, in this house, the one I had once been afraid to breathe in, turning it into a place where others could finally breathe freely. When I left, I took only the letter, an old photo, and a carved wooden box. Everything else I left as it was. But inside, something had begun to form. I knew I'd return one day. Not as a daughter, but as a woman who had turned pain into strength. The past didn't come back to hurt me. It came to show me. I had grown. I was free. And now I could help others find their freedom too. 7 months passed since I left the village. Spring in New York was cold, but I felt a warmth inside, as if something deep within me was beginning to thaw, to stretch, to bloom. I worked on new collections, continued teaching classes for women, took on commissions, but my thoughts kept circling back to that old house, where everything had once begun. I started seeing it in my dreams, not as before. Dark and threatening, but different, with open windows, fresh air drifting through, the scent of bread in the air. In those dreams, there were women, girls, light, laughter, sewing machines, patterns, fabrics, books, as if fate itself was sketching out a blueprint for my future. And I understood. It was time to return, not for a visit, but for real. For however long it would take. I gathered the paperwork, spoke to a lawyer, officially transferred the property into my name. Alex, as always, supported me without hesitation. "Do it," he said. "I know you're not just going back. You're going to breathe life into that house." So I went. When I stepped off the bus and back onto that familiar path, my heart was racing. Everything seemed smaller than I remembered, but no less important. The house stood just as before, but this time I entered it differently. Not as someone running away, but as someone coming home. The first thing I did was open all the windows, the entire day. Then the front door. I scrubbed the floors, took down the old curtains, tossed out most of the furniture. Except one thing. A stool with the carved letters D.W., Daniel Walker. My brother, he was gone now, but his memory lived on. I wrote the project plan and called it simply the Women's Handcraft House of Maple Hollow. The mission: to teach sewing, embroidery, basic design, and economics, free of charge for any woman who wanted to learn. At first, people looked at me with suspicion. She's back now? To save us or something? Others just watched silently. I didn't try to convince anyone, I just began. The neighbor girl, Alina, was the first to come. Then her mother, then the local police officer's wife. A month later, we were 8. I brought old sewing machines from the city, fabrics, notebooks. We started with simple things: aprons, pillowcases, tote bags. Then came dresses, then embroidery with the same ancient symbols Grandma Cora once taught me. But I didn't just teach them about thread and cloth. I talked about building yourself, about courage, about believing again. One day during a class, a woman named Gail said, "You have no idea what this means to us. My husband drinks, my son left. There's no work. But here, you made us feel alive again." I couldn't respond. My throat tightened. I just smiled. And in that moment, I knew. This house was no longer about pain. It was about life. A new life. A year later, we held our first exhibition at the regional center. The girls showed off their work. They were invited to nearby towns to teach workshops. Orders started coming in. Some began earning money. Others simply smiled more often. I registered the school as a foundation, then turned it into a nonprofit organization. We received support from the local government. The house was renovated. A second wing was added, new heating installed, a fresh roof put in place. But more importantly, the walls of that house were no longer silent. They echoed with laughter, with voices. One day, standing by the gate, I saw Alina, the very first girl who came, teaching newcomers how to hold a needle. She spoke with confidence, her eyes glowing. I watched her and thought, this is it. This is the finest dress I've ever made. I named the school after my brother, the Daniel Walker Institute of Handcrafts. Let him live not only in a stool and in memory, but in the lives of these young women. The house where I once feared to breathe had become a place that breathed on its own, a place that healed, that built. And I was no longer afraid to return to it, because I knew I had changed it. and it had changed me. I didn't realize when my small project turned into something much greater. It all began with a letter. It arrived on an autumn morning, stamped with an official seal and printed in firm, formal script. The Department of Labor and Social Development of the United States expresses interest in your work establishing rural women's craft education programs. I read the letter several times, unable to believe it. I was just a simple woman from Maple Hollow. My workshop, my school, my girls, now under the eyes of the state. At first, I was afraid. I didn't want politics, paperwork, lofty speeches. I was scared I'd lose what made all this alive. The closeness, the warmth, the deeply personal. But Alex said, "Edith, this isn't a threat. It's a chance. If you did this here, imagine how many women across the country are waiting for the same thing." And he was right. I was invited to a women's entrepreneurship forum in Washington, D.C. I stood on a stage in front of hundreds. Ministers, policymakers, journalists filled the seats. My hands trembled. I didn't speak like a public figure. I spoke as a woman who had lived through fear, through poverty, through silence. I talked about pain and strength and the meaning of craft. And when I finished, the room rose to its feet. The next day, I was offered a grant. The terms were clear. I had to create a foundation, develop a program, train teams in other regions. It was terrifying. I wasn't a businesswoman or a politician, but I knew how to mend wounds with thread. I knew how to build trust, stitch by stitch. That's how the Edith Walker Foundation for Women's Crafts and Labor was born. I didn't name it myself. My girls did. I wanted something modest. They said, "Let it carry your name. We're proud of it." Within a year, we had 7 schools across the country, from the Rocky Mountains to rural Pennsylvania, down through Kentucky, and up to northern Michigan. The girls from Maple Hollow became instructors. I watched them travel to other towns and villages, not to talk about fashion, but to talk about self-worth. Each new school felt like a birth. We planted an apple tree at the entrance as a symbol of growth, and on each tree, a plaque read, "A new breath begins here." The foundation became known. We were invited to speak on television, in newspapers, at festivals. But I always said, "We're not charity. We're the return of strength. We don't pity. We respect." One day, a woman in her 60s approached me after a class in a small community center in upstate New York. Her hands were rough, her skin worn, her gaze heavy with exhaustion. "I can't read. I can't sew," she said. "My father beat me. My husband drank. My son left. I don't think I'm a woman anymore, just a shell." I sat beside her. I placed fabric and a needle in her hands. We sat in silence. Her first stitches were crooked, hesitant. But by evening, she looked up and said, "I'm alive. My name is Maria." And I understood then. Everything we do isn't about fashion. It's about restoring names. People sometimes asked me, "Why didn't you move abroad?" Paris, Milan, they would have welcomed you. And I always replied, because I stayed where the pain was strongest, because that's where the need was greatest. My home in Maple Hollow became our headquarters. We added a new building. Now it houses the foundation's office, a library, and a conference hall. Women from our partner schools across the country come for residencies. I host masterclasses, drink tea with them, listen to their stories. Each meeting feels like the first. Like coming home, Alex now leads the educational branch. He designed a youth program to teach teens not just sewing, but how to manage, calculate, plan. Because true freedom begins with independence. Within a few years, our foundation became part of a national initiative. We helped over 50,000 women. Many launched their own businesses. Some, yes, became teachers. One of them, Gail from Montana, is now a local councilwoman. She told me, "I used to sew to speak, now I speak to protect." And I believe we're just getting started. My small workshop on Roosevelt Island still stands. I visit on Saturdays. Everything's just as it was. Spools, scissors, the wooden plaque. But now it feels like a museum of memory. Because the movement has grown beyond it. Because the woman who once fled a village has now built one within every woman she's met. And that's my greatest creation. I hadn't been back to New York City in more than 5 years. Life kept rushing forward. One project, another, speeches, letters, schools, travel. I was constantly in motion, caring for others, chasing dreams that came true faster than I could write them down. But one sleepless night in Maple Hollow, I woke suddenly with a knowing. It's time. Time to go back. To where I first stopped being afraid, where my name was spoken aloud for the first time, where I didn't just build walls, I built myself. New York met me with rain, as it always did. The narrow streets of the Lower East Side, people with umbrellas, trolleys skimming through puddles. Everything was as it had been, as if waiting for me. I walked slowly, remembering every brick, every archway, every sign. My old studio was still running, now led by Lisa and Grace. They met me with flowers, hugs, and tears. "Without you, the air smells different," Lisa said. We drank tea in the same room where I once hand-stitched my first collars. The walls had been repainted, the furniture updated, but the air still carried the scent of lavender, steam, and faith. They showed me sketches, orders, photos of clients. The studio had grown up, strong and confident, like a child coming into their own. But the real reason for my return still lay ahead. I had been invited to speak at the Mariinsky Theater during the annual Voices of Change Forum honoring women in Russia. They wanted to award me a national medal for contributions to rural education and culture. I hesitated. A medal is an honor, but for me, what mattered wasn't recognition. It was the chance to say something real again. That evening backstage, I stood in a dress I had sewn myself. Dark green linen, embroidered sleeves, and a chest motif of sun and wheat. A symbol of life. A symbol of labor. I looked in the mirror and saw that girl from the frozen village. The one who once feared to even speak. And now, she speaks. For thousands. For herself. When I walked on stage, the auditorium was full. Women of every age, famous and unknown, with stories etched into their faces. I knew among them were women just like me. And I said, "I'm not standing here because I'm special. I'm standing here because once, one woman, my aunt, knocked on my window and said, 'Come with me.' And I did. Because one grandmother, Cora, placed a needle in my hand and said, 'Sew.' And I did. Because once, there was no one who believed in me. So I learned to believe in myself. And now I'm not alone. There are thousands of us. We are not a movement. We are a river. And no dam can stop us." The room was silent. Then it rose to its feet. I didn't cry. I just felt warmth flowing through me. Not from the award, but from the sense of completion. I had made the journey. From darkness to light. From fear to voice. And now I could pass that light on. Afterward, women from every region came up to me. Some hugged me. Some gave me handkerchiefs. One young girl with a braid down her back whispered, "I sew because you sew." I returned to my hotel late that night. I sat by the window. The city shimmered in the distance, and I realized this wasn't a return. It was a farewell. Quiet, grateful, peaceful. The city had made me. And now I was giving back what I'd taken. My heart belongs to Maple Hollow. To my students, to the house where life sings again. But New York is my beginning. My springboard, my first breath. And I will never forget it. One winter evening, as a snowstorm battered the windows and the house stood quiet, I pulled out my old writing desk, brewed a strong cup of tea with thyme, and for the first time in many years, I began to write. Not reports, not proposals, not plans, just a blank page. At the top, I wrote one word. You. It was a letter without a name, without an address, without a stamp. Just you. You who sit by the stove and listen to your father yelling in the kitchen. You who wash your husband's shirts every evening without hearing thank you or sorry. You who think your time has passed and it's too late to start. You who are afraid, who don't believe, who don't know it could ever be different. And I wrote to her. You are not alone. I too once sat in the dark. I too was afraid to speak, to breathe, to dream. I thought all I was allowed to do was stay silent and cook. But one day, I stood up. Not all at once. First inside, then on my feet, then through action. I wrote one letter, then another. I never mailed them. I tied them with twine and kept them in a box. Each page was like a voice in the wilderness, a hand reaching out across space. I knew that somewhere, someone would read them. Not necessarily with their eyes, but with their heart. Over time, I began reading those letters aloud during our sessions, first in Maple Hollow, then in other schools across the foundation. The women listened in stillness. Many cried, some for the first time in years, because they weren't hearing slogans or lectures or theories, but something real, something alive. After one reading, a young woman named Natalie came up to me. She was thin, quiet, with eyes like deep water, she whispered. That letter was about me. You didn't know me, but I heard you. From that day on, the letters became part of my work. I printed them in small books, gave them away for free. Sometimes I left them on train seats, in libraries, on park benches. Each one ended the same way. Not with a period, but a phrase. You can, because just by reading this far, you've already begun. Some letters became prayers, others manifestos. Some were just pieces of memory. How I first held a needle, how I hid books under the floor, how I feared I'd never make it out of that village alive. How I did, how I turned fear into a tool. The letters became mirrors, not just of me, but of the women who read them. They said, your pain is not the only pain, and it is not forever. Women began writing back, not formally, genuinely, some by hand, some by embroidering words onto fabric, some as songs they sang to their daughters at night. We created a space without distance, where teacher and student were simply two women, looking at each other with recognition. Alex said I had become like a storyteller from the old world. But my tales weren't about kings. They were about Maria from rural Maine, about Sarah from the Blue Ridge, about Aisha from the mountain villages of Utah. And each one was a heroine, not because she conquered the world, but because she started. When I turned 75, the women from the foundation organized an exhibition, Letters That Hear, white canvases hung on the walls, covered in stitched words and silences that said more than any speech. I don't know how many more I'll have time to write, I said. Time doesn't ask permission, but while I have a voice, I write. Because every woman sitting in the dark deserves to one day hear, you are not alone. Old age doesn't arrive like a storm. It creeps in. First through the joints, then the eyes, then the quiet between words. But I don't fear it. Aging isn't fading. It's like the last chapter of a book, where every page finally makes sense. I'm 78. Sometimes when I look at my hands, I see everything in them. The bruises of childhood, the stitches of youth, the folds of pain, the lines of hope. These aren't just hands. They're a map of my life. And now they hold not just roads, but roots. I always believed a woman needs both. Roots, where she feels at home, and wings to leave when she must. One without the other is incomplete. Without roots, you don't know who you are. Without wings, you'll never know who you could be. My roots are in Maple Hollow, in the house where silence once screamed louder than any voice. In the snow where I cried my first hidden tears. In the floorboards where Daniel and I guarded forbidden books like treasures. Now, when I sit on the porch of our school and watch the girls carry rolls of fabric, laughing, discussing patterns, I feel that my roots are not just alive. They're nourishing something far greater. My wings are in every one of them. In Lisa, who opened a new studio in Alaska. In Alina, who now directs a regional branch. In Maria, who began writing stories about women who overcame fear. They are my continuation. Not copies, not students, but strong, different, independent women. And that's the most beautiful thing. People ask, isn't it scary? Letting go, handing things over, stepping back? No, it's not scary. For years, I carried everything alone because no one else could. But now there are others. And I'm not leaving. I'm simply stepping aside so they can move forward. I no longer dream of stages or medals or headlines. My treasure is in the letters that still come to our old address, like one that said, Dear Edith Walker, I never met you, but your book was with my mom when we lived in a remote village in Alaska. I grew up reading it at night. Now I teach girls to sew in our town. Thank you for being. I read letters like that and understand. A name isn't just a plaque on a door. A name is something passed hand to hand, heart to heart, and if one day my name becomes just a symbol, I'm fine with that. Let it be a charm. The first line, the thread where everything begins. We recently planted an apple orchard behind the school. The girls suggested naming each tree after a woman who changed someone's life. I resisted. But one quiet evening, Lisa brought me to a young sapling. On its plaque, it read, Edith, roots here, wings everywhere. I couldn't hold back my tears, not because I was moved, but because it was true. I'm aging not in pain, but in pride. My body may tire, but my spirit won't. And as long as it lives, I'll continue to speak, to sew, to write, or simply to sit beside a girl making her first stitches, so she knows. Near her is warmth, is story, is a woman who once feared and lived. I sit in my office, the same room where a sewing machine once stood. Now there are computers, books, photos from across the country. On the wall is a map covered in pins. Alaska, Vermont, California, Georgia, Montana, Washington. Each pin is not a city, it's a woman, a story, a voice. Alina knocked on the door. Twice, quick with that light smile. We have news, she said as she stepped in. Officially, since the foundation began, 50,001 women have completed our programs. I looked at her silently. 50,001. Somehow, it was the one that hit hardest. She wasn't lost in the number. She was there, seen, alive, with her name, with her voice. I thanked Alina, watched her walk away, and stayed seated. I closed my eyes. 50,000. 50,000 voices that once stayed silent. 50,000 pairs of hands that used to hide, now stitching, building, painting, writing. 50,000 women, each an entire universe. I remembered them. Fatima from Utah, who opened the first sewing studio in a mountain town where no one had worked with fabric before. Nina from Georgia, a mother of 4, who became a teacher 2 years after finishing the course. Larissa from Oregon, who relearned how to sew after a stroke, just to feel like herself again. I remembered their laughter, their tears, how they looked in the mirror during fittings, how they handed their daughters their first earnings from a scarf, like a talisman. More than anything, I hoped that one day someone would say, I am not alone, because she was. Even if they never knew my name, even if they didn't know where I came from. If in some home a light shines, if someone puts on a dress and straightens their back, then it was worth it. That evening, the whole team gathered in our big hall. The girls brought out the samovar, baked pies. Someone suggested we hold a small gathering, informal, just to be together. I hadn't prepared a speech. I stood in front of them, looked at their faces. Young, old, lined with age, braided, gray-haired, tattooed, in long skirts. So different. So dear, 50,000, I said quietly. It's as if an entire town spoke at once. And yet each of you is that town. Not just a seamstress, not just a participant, but a voice. They clapped, some cried, and I thought of myself at 17, standing on a snowy road, holding a little bundle, afraid, walking, not knowing where. If only she could look ahead. If only she knew that one day her words would be heard by 50,000 others. After the evening, Alex and I sat on the porch. He poured me tea and, without looking, said, You feel it, don't you? That the space between numbers is where lives happen, and it's quiet now, because it's full of light. I nodded. He was right, as always. 50,000 isn't an end. It's a breath, a force, 1,000 yeses in place of thousands of nos. And I'm simply the one who started the first stitch. Sometimes I wake up very early, before dawn, before the first sounds outside, before the iron hisses or the roof begins to drip. I sit in my chair, wrapped in a shawl, and listen as the house breathes. It breathes truly. There is no fear left in these walls. The floors no longer creak with the steps of a fleeing girl. Now there are other sounds. Laughter, machines humming, scissors snapping, conversations about fabric, and the silence where ideas are born. I'll be 80 soon. I don't fear the number. It's like an embroidery pattern. Repetition, rhythm, completion. I finished my stitch work, and I look at it not with regret, but with pride. They often call me a legend now, a symbol, a voice of a generation. They write articles, film documentaries, ask me to share the secret of success. I smile and say, there's no secret. There's just the path. Your own. Once, I thought the most important thing would be to leave behind a school, a foundation, books, embroidery. But now I know. The most important thing is the memory, not of me, but within the women who once heard me say, you can. That word is a key. I gave it into the hands of thousands, and they opened their own doors. I didn't lead them. I simply stood beside them, and that was enough. My home is no longer just a studio. It's a pilgrimage. Students, their daughters, their granddaughters visit. They look at the old sewing machine, the sketches, the chair by the window, and I tell them, take the thread. Begin. Don't be afraid. Your story will be different, but no less beautiful. I've passed on the work. Lisa now leads the foundation. Alina oversees all branches. Alex is retired now and writing a book on education through craft. We often sit together reading letters from women all over the country. Some are short. Thank you. You gave me back to myself. Others are confessions, the kind you only read under a lamp, hand on heart. I don't sew much anymore, just for myself. The last thing I made was a scarf embroidered with symbols of sun, water, and wind. I asked for it to be buried with me, not from superstition, but as a sign that I wasn't afraid to live, and I'm not afraid to go. Sometimes I wonder what will remain, and I answer myself. Women, thousands of women walking their own paths, backs straight, needles in hand, fire in their hearts. They are not my property, not my shadows. They are my trace, my life, well lived. I don't know if there will ever be a statue. I don't know if someone will write a book. But if one day in some small village a woman gets up in the morning, puts on a dress she made with her own hands, looks in the mirror and says, I can, then that's enough. And I'll be sitting quietly in the sky on an old wooden stool looking down and whispering, so, go, speak, live,